Welcome to the Bible Savvy Podcast, a weekly conversation about how to understand, enjoy, and apply God's Word. It's time to jump into a new passage from the Bible Savvy reading plan.
Hello and welcome to another bonus episode of the Bible Savvy Podcast. We're asking the question today, is the Old Testament good for women? I'm Clayton Keenan, and I have the privilege of welcoming back returning guest Dr. Carmen Imes to the podcast today. This year, we have been reading through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes called the books of Moses or the Pentateuch. And along the way, we've come across some stories and some laws that seem to be bad news for women. I've been asked about this by a few people, and I knew our friend Dr. Imes would be able to give us some insight on these passages, so we've welcomed her back. Dr. Imes is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University. She's the author of several fantastic books, including Bearing God's Name and Being God's Image. And later this year, a 3rd volume in that series is coming out called Becoming God's Family, which is going to be great. She's also working on a commentary on Exodus that I'm super excited about. So, Dr. Imes, welcome back to the Bible Savvy Podcast.
Thank you, Clayton, for having me. Great to be back.
All right, let's jump in. We got a lot of questions here. So let's start at the beginning. All right, on the first couple of pages of the Bible, we've got the creation of human beings, and it seems to start off really well. In Genesis 1, it says God created humans in his image, male and female, he created them. So we've got men and women, both made in the image of God. But then in chapter 2, we've got the story of the creation of woman, and it says that God made her to be a helper suitable for the man, which very much comes across as kind of putting the woman in the second place role. Help us understand what that's all about.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because this is kind of where we get off on the wrong foot in understanding what does it mean to be male and what does it mean to be female, and how do we relate to each other as two sexes. So I think the reason we misunderstand what's going on here is because the word helper in English seems like a subservient role of some kind. But if we look at the Hebrew, the phrase that God uses here to say, he says it's not good for the man to be alone. This is the first thing that's not good in creation. So this is significant after calling things good. He says, I will make an azer kenegdo for him. So the word azer is the word that's translated helper. If we look at all the other places in the Hebrew Bible where that word occurs, either in noun form or in verb form, it's almost 100 uses, and half of those are used to refer to or describe Yahweh. So that, I think, right out of the gate tells us, okay, helper cannot mean subservient. Like, that's not a core part of its meaning, because Yahweh is not subservient to us. The other half of the uses of this word refer to a warrior or an army. It's a military term. Never is this word azer used to describe what a servant does for his master or what an employee does for an employer. It's always someone who is strong coming alongside someone who needs assistance and standing side by side with them to assist. So I think now the word helper can be used in that way. We can talk about God as our helper, but because it's God, we assume he's strong and we're weak and we need his help. Somehow that assumption does not get carried over into Genesis 2. So I think it would be better to translate this that I will make an ally corresponding to him. Maybe it's something that has more of a connotation of side by side, the two of you are going to get the job done.
Oh, that's very helpful, especially when you put it in terms of an ally, it suddenly changes things. It's certainly someone who is helping you in a strict sense, but it's not a servant kind of role. That's really great.
Right.
But let's turn to the page, okay? Because in Genesis 3, when humanity falls to temptation, is expelled from the garden, it sure seems like the blame is mostly pinned on Eve. How does that not contribute to seeing women as either more gullible or morally weaker or somehow to blame for all of this mess?
I actually find it encouraging that Eve is blamed for this.
Really?
Because she is culpable. She does lead Adam into sin. She was supposed to be an ally who would help him obey, and she doesn't. She does the opposite of that. And what would trouble me about this passage is if God said to Adam, this is all your fault because you didn't keep your wife in line, as if he's responsible for her obedience. But instead, God addresses her as a moral agent that is capable of making decisions and capable of leading, and she leads in an improper way in this chapter. But I actually feel like the problem with Eve in this chapter is not that she was too, sometimes people will spin Genesis 3 as though the problem is Eve stepped in and led, and she should have been following. But you already mentioned in Genesis 1 that both male and female are the image of God. And what does an image do? An image is supposed to fill the earth and subdue it. Subdue is a strong word in Hebrew, kabosh. They are supposed to kabosh anything that is trying to usurp God's authority. And the snake, the serpent in chapter 3 is doing exactly that. What Eve should have done is been more forceful and kaboshed the serpent. That is her role as a woman made as God's image. So the problem is not that Eve was leading. The problem is that she was leading in the wrong direction. And so the fact that God treats her as a moral agent, I think, is important.
Oh, that's very helpful. It gets worse, though, when we turn the page again, right? So we start into Genesis. We've got the stories of the patriarchs. And honestly, it's a bit sad, right? You've got a lot of stories about women who are basically being used by men. Abraham kind of does something weird with Sarah, saying, well, she's my sister, so she gets taken into Pharaoh's harem, and Abraham sleeps with his servant Hagar, and Jacob negotiates with Laban about marrying Rachel and Leah and all these things. And it feels a lot of the time like the men are using women as bargaining chips or something like that. Like they don't have a lot of agency.
They certainly are.
Okay, so that it is what it seems. So how do we do that?
It is what it seems.
When these men are, in some ways, the good guys. I mean, they're God's people. We're to look at them as, patriarchs or kind of fathers in the people of God. How do we handle these stories then?
Yeah. So we need to separate and understand the difference between description and prescription. God is describing, or the narrator is describing in God-inspired ways what happened. But just because something happened doesn't mean it was the right thing or it was okay. So I would say we are not being asked to emulate their behavior. We are being asked to see the consequences of their behavior. Last Sunday, I actually had the opportunity to preach on Hebrews 11, and that's a chapter that I've really struggled with because Hebrews 11 seems to hold up many of these men as moral examples. And I'm like, I've read these stories. I don't see them as very good moral examples. At best, they're a mixed bag. They have moments of lucidity where they do things right. And then many moments where it's like, what were you thinking? So I was really helped to realize or reframe chapter 11 of Hebrews, not as a list of heroes who we should emulate, but as a list of ordinary men and women who happen to put their eggs in the right basket. I used the example of a roller coaster. When somebody rides a roller coaster, it's like an impressive experience, but the rider is not what's impressive. It's whoever designed the roller coaster. So someone gets off a roller coaster, you don't clap them on the back and congratulate them for their tremendous achievement. All they did was wait in line and then sit there and strap in. They didn't actually. It's not the rider, it's the ride.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Oh, that's so good.
And what I find even more interesting is there are some pretty squeaky clean good examples in the Old Testament. None of them show up in Hebrews 11. There's no Elijah. There's no Daniel. There's no midwives of the Exodus. Like, we actually have some pretty great heroes in the Old Testament that we don't have any dirt on. And they're not in that chapter. And they would have been the obvious choice. So I don't think that the author of Hebrews is actually trying to give us moral examples. So when we don't like the patriarchs, I think that's okay.
That's good. It's good because that's how it feels when you read it. This is probably similar, but what about polygamy? Okay, so especially these patriarchs, they've got multiple wives. Why is it okay for all these men in the stories to do that?
Again, the narrator is describing, not prescribing how we should live. So polygamy happens in the Old Testament. it usually happens for bad reasons. Why does Abraham take Hagar into his tent? Well, Sarah sort of pushes it on him, and they're trying to like help God fulfill his promises instead of waiting for God's solution to their infertility. Why does Jacob take 2 wives and then that turns into 4? First of all, because his father-in-law is a schmuck and deceives him. And then second of all, his wives are involved in this arms race, kind of to see who can get the most boys. And so they bring their maidservants into Jacob's tent as well to try to rack up more sons on their side of the ledger. So this is not an example to emulate. There is a very limited there's a limited set of reasons that could make polygamy okay in ancient Israel for a very specific situation where a man dies and his wife has not borne him any children, and now his inheritance is in jeopardy. And so she is supposed to be married to his brother-in-law, and he impregnates her in order to produce an heir for the line of the dead man. Theoretically, that could result in polygamy if the brother's already married. And the Bible doesn't say only if he's single should he do this. So possibly we could end up with multiple wives, and that would be basically a charity case towards the dead man. So yeah, the Bible is not encouraging us to engage in polygamy. In fact, every occasion where there's multiple wives does not turn out well.
Yeah. There are some stories in Genesis in particular that are very difficult to read because there's quite a bit of violence against women.
Yes.
Lot and his daughters, Dinah, who's one of Jacob's daughters, is sexually assaulted. We've already mentioned Hagar. This may fall in a similar place as it's descriptive, but what are we supposed to make of these stories and the significance and why they're important in here?
Yeah, the stories are included whenever they're important to the plot line. So they're not being included to glorify what happened or to somehow suggest God is okay with this or whatever. I think what it illustrates for us is that God speaks into and acts on behalf of people in messy situations. So the ancient world is not different than the modern world. We have messy families, messy neighborhoods where women are often mistreated. And so the Bible is unflinching in its description of that. It's not glorifying these incidents, but it recounts the stories whenever they're important for us to know, why do people move here, or why do they have a beef against these people over here? If the story is necessary to the plot, we'll hear it. As we move on out of the Pentateuch, there are some cases where these stories are told explicitly in order to illustrate for us how bad things have become. That Israel, so the story of the rape and dismemberment of the woman at the end of Judges it's told so that we notice the parallels with the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and that we can see that God's people have spiraled downward so that their moral compass is so broken that they would engage in this kind of behavior and then defend those who engaged in this kind of behavior. And Israel would be at war with itself instead of with its enemies on the outside. So it's a snapshot of how bad things have become. And it absolutely does not indicate that God is okay with this. It's the opposite. He's showing us what happens when we reject him as king and go our own way, make our own choices. We become no better than these pagan nations around the Israelites.
Yeah. I have found with some people who have some sort of violence or sexual assault in their history that while these stories are very hard, there's also something where people have said they actually appreciate that these are included in the Bible because it acknowledges the reality that happens behind closed doors to a lot of people, or things that don't get talked about. And in some ways, they say, why do we avoid those stories all the time? At least at some point, we should talk about them. I've never had the courage to preach on one of them, but I think we need to.
In my class at Biola, I actually read through the ending of Judges, like all 4 chapters. We read it verse by verse and talk about it for this reason. And I allow students to join on Zoom rather than in person if they feel like it's going to be triggering for them because of their own histories or sensitivities. But I encourage everybody to participate because I think it's so important for us to see. God is not holding this up as an example. This is exhibit A in what happens when we disregard God's covenant law.
Mm. Well, let's talk about some of the laws because we should, look at the laws and say this is good, but on the surface, some of these don't seem so good. So let me go through a few particular ones. I'm just going to read some of these and ask what you think about them. So one is in Exodus 22. It says this: if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. Now, honestly, this feels like the woman is being bought and sold, like she's property or something like that. Why did a man pay a woman's father to marry her?
Yeah, so women were under the protection of their father or male head of household. That was just how the culture was set up. And so any marriage between a man and a woman would involve the exchange of wealth between these two families. And it's not because the woman is property to be sold. The financial transaction is actually designed to cement the bond between the two families and provide a kind of social safety net so that if something goes wrong in this marriage, the woman is not destitute. So it's like a providing surety or providing security for the woman. That's why wealth trades hands. So there are some situations that we'll probably talk about where wealth doesn't go in both directions. Where the money only goes one direction. And then that feels like, slavery. But in a normal arranged marriage, so every marriage is arranged by the father of the woman because it's his responsibility to make sure she's well cared for. So the exchange of wealth is to ensure that. In the case of Exodus 22, 16 and 17, which you just read, this is not an example of rape. This is an example of seduction. So this woman has basically consented to be with the man, but there has not been a promise to care for her. And so this is a law that tries to eliminate casual sex or one-night stands. This is saying that's not the right context for a sexual relationship. The right context is when you have made a lifelong commitment to this woman. You can't just take her and use her and discard her. So if you do so, if you try to have a tryst with this woman, you are now responsible to pay the bride price and take her into your home. So it's trying to deter a casual attitude towards sex. But notice that there's a clause here: if the father refuses to give her to him, if he thinks that guy's a schmuck, and this is not a good situation for my daughter, or my daughter is telling me she doesn't want to be with him, then he still has to pay. He still has the financial responsibility, but he doesn't get to have her as his wife. So this is actually a protection set up for women so that men don't treat them as discardable sexual partners.
That's really helpful reframing. One thing that I think is behind some of the comments you said is a difference we don't always think explicitly about. It's the fact that in our society, any individual male or female can go out and get a job for themselves. And in this case, if you've got a woman who is part of a household, it's not, if she's on her own, and it's up to the head of household to secure for all of their household what they need, because it's not like they're individuals just going out and saying, well, I applied for this job and now I've got an income.
Yes, right. Yeah, it's their economy is built on agriculture. They have fields, they have flocks and herds. And so you're right. You can't just go out and get a job that creates income. You're producing wealth off of the land. And so you can't be unattached to a family. If you're unattached to a family, it makes you very vulnerable to be destitute, because it's not like you can just go apply for a job. You also can't go down to the local Walmart and get your groceries. You have to grow what you eat. And so you need to be attached to a household that's growing food.
Yeah. All right. Another law here, also in Exodus, this is in Exodus 21. It says this: if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide for her these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. So there are some things in here that do seem to be protecting, but the whole premise seems a little off to us, right? So why is it okay for a man to sell his daughter as a servant? And why doesn't she get to go free as the male servants do in other circumstances?
Yes. So this is a very hot topic, as I've discovered in my YouTube. On my YouTube channel, I release weekly videos called Torah Tuesday, and I'm working my way slowly through Exodus. And I have just a few weeks ago released some videos on Exodus 21 on these verses. And I quickly found out that people get very up in arms about it because some people, and it's interesting who responds strongly, but the atheists among us feel like the Bible, the Old Testament, condones slavery, and that makes them upset. And so anyone who tries to interpret it in a way that's softer than that, they accuse of lying or playing fast and loose with the Bible and not just acknowledging it's a patriarchal text that endorses slavery. But also there are Christians who get upset at conversations around this as well. So I've been shot at from both sides in the past month over this issue. So let me first say, what we're looking at here is called a casuistic law. It's part of the Mishpatim. Casuistic law, by definition, or case law, is dealing with non-ideal situations. So it's addressing a situation that is already not ideal, and it's setting parameters to make sure to minimize the exploitation that could happen in those less than ideal circumstances. So God is not saying, hey, guys, sell your daughter. Like if you could benefit from the sale of your daughter, you should do that. This is not encouraging the sale of daughters. This is putting up parameters around a particular situation. As I mentioned, anytime there's a marriage, it's arranged by the father with the groom and his family, and there's an exchange of wealth that goes in both directions. This is addressing a situation in which wealth does not go both ways, but only one way. So the man is offering his daughter as a servant, and he is being paid, but he doesn't have any money to send with her as a dowry. It's clear from the passage that you read that she is marrying into the family. She's entering into the family sexually, which is why she's treated differently than a male who is coming into a family to pay off a debt. So the wider context seems to suggest that this is a case of indentured servitude, where one family has a debt they cannot pay to another family. Maybe their crop failed, and so they had to borrow food from a family whose crop didn't fail, but they're having a hard time catching up and paying that off. So one way to handle that is to take somebody from the indebted household and have them work off the debt with the family that made the loan. If it's a man who goes over to do that, he's not marrying into the family because he already has land inheritance through his household. So it would be temporary, and the limit of that servitude is set at 6 years. But if a woman is going, the presumption is she's marrying into the household, but there's not an equal exchange of wealth. So that is why she can't be set free without payment at the end of 6 years, or she can't be set free. She also can't be sold to foreigners because she's not a sexual plaything. She's not a sex slave. She's actually being married. And this is where we see this when it says, if he selects her, so the master who has selected her for himself implies that he's marrying her. If he selects her for his son, it's as his marriage partner, he has to treat her like a daughter-in-law, not like a household sex slave. In other words, she is not available to the head of household if she is married to the son of the head of household. He has to treat her like a daughter, which means she's off limits to him. It says if he marries another woman. Now, this is an example of polygamy. It's describing a non-ideal situation. If for some reason the man takes another wife, he is not allowed to reduce what he provides for the first woman who came into his household in non-ideal circumstances. So this whole situation is trying to set up guardrails to make sure that she's not used and discarded or used by multiple men, but that she's treated with dignity as a regular member of the household.
In some ways, she is coming into that family in an even more vulnerable situation than she would have. And so this is saying, let's shore that up, because otherwise this could be very exploitive.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's very helpful. There's a lot in there. I'm sure people have to get their heads around, but that's much clearer than the way it comes across on the surface. Okay, let's go to another law here. Deuteronomy 21 says this: when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you are not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Okay, so this feels like another unideal situation.
It is.
But it's a battle, right? So you win a battle, you can just take one of the women captive as your wife. What's going on here?
Yes. So again, in the ancient world, all marriages are arranged by fathers. So if you've gone into battle and you've just killed the men, how does a marriage get arranged with a woman? Like how would it even be possible? So this is, as you said, dealing with a non-ideal situation in a wider cultural context where the general attitude in war is, if you can capture a woman, she's all yours. Do whatever you want with her. And this is saying, if you go to war and there's a woman that you take captive, you don't get to just have her. Here's the proper procedure that gives her time to mourn for her family, and that cuts ties with the culture that she's coming from, because she's coming into a community that is supposed to be devoted to the worship of Yahweh alone. So there's some risk involved in marrying a foreign woman because she might be a worshiper of another god. But you can't just take her. I find it interesting that her head is to be shaved. This would be a normal expression of mourning, like to pull your hair out or whatever. But it would also, I would think, serve as a kind of deterrent. If you see a woman and she has this beautiful long hair and you think, I want to marry her, you can only have her if you shave her head first, which means you're willing, this is not just a one night stand or instant gratification. You have to be committed to her for the long haul in order for her to return to her former glory. Is going to take some time. So I don't love this passage. Can I say that?
I think you're allowed to do that. You're the Old Testament professor, so I'll let you decide.
I mean, I don't love the idea of taking captives in battle, but this is addressing an ancient situation where this sort of thing is happening all the time, and it's putting severe limits. You can't just take every woman and use and discard her. If you see a woman, she's going to become your wife after a waiting period. So it's upping the stakes of capturing a woman. It's making it more difficult for you and giving her time to grieve. So I heard Sandra Richter give a paper on this passage, and she was comparing it to the way ISIS treats women in the areas today, where it goes in and, will ravage a village, and the rape of women during wartime is something that has happened throughout history without any boundaries. Men just take women when they're in battle and they rape and discard them. And God is saying, that's not how you're going to be. If you want a woman, you have to be committed to her for the rest of her life. This is a long-term scenario. So Dr. Richter was arguing that this scenario is far better than what we see even today in the Middle East under ISIS. So she was saying, I think if you ask a woman in a wartime situation, which kind of administration would she prefer, she would choose Deuteronomy over the typical wartime practices.
Yeah. That's a heavy one, but it makes a lot of sense. Especially because we're comparing it to the ideal and looking at this. When you compare it to the real, it actually mitigates the awfulness of those situations.
And we're also comparing it to our love stories. Like we're reading from the comfort of our own, suburban middle-class life in the United States, where we had the freedom to marry whoever we wanted to marry because we fell in love.
Yeah.
And we arranged, marriage is a whole different kind of thing in the ancient world than it is now. The way a marriage is brought about, who's involved in making that decision, what are the parameters around it. It's such a cultural mismatch with the way we think about romance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a totally different category.
And all of that. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Another one, it does concern marriage, but the marriage already exists. Okay. So, and this one is, I'm going to have to summarize it because I can't read the whole passage because it's kind of involved. But in Numbers chapter 5, there's this law about what to do when a man suspects his wife is cheating on him. And it's basically situations where the man is jealous, but doesn't really have proof. He hasn't caught her in the act or something like that. So the man goes to the priest, accuses his wife of unfaithfulness. The priest makes her take an oath that if she was unfaithful, that she'd be cursed, that her womb would miscarry, her abdomen would swell. And then the priest takes some water, mixes some dust from the floor of the tabernacle, makes her drink it. That's all a little strange. And then if she gets sick, she's guilty, but if not, she's innocent. Now, there's a lot of things I've got questions about that, but the main ones are this. Like, how is this a helpful thing? And why is there no equivalent test if a woman suspects her husband of being unfaithful?
Yes. So this is a tricky passage. I've been really helped by Ashley's commentary. It's in the New International Commentary in the Old Testament series. So I actually wrote in the margins of my Bible some quotations from that commentary because this question comes up a lot. The first thing I want to say is the thing that he's asking her to drink is actually not toxic. It's dirt, and he actually writes the curse on a piece of paper and washes the ink into the water. But nothing that the woman is ingesting is an abortifacient. It's not going to cause a miscarriage. It's an innocuous substance. I'm sure it didn't taste amazing, but it's not actually dangerous. And so what this is doing, the overall thrust of this passage is it's taking the accusation of the husband that could be completely made up in his head, right? Like he could just be fantasizing about or paranoid about his wife's unfaithfulness when she hasn't been unfaithful. We've all seen situations like this in movies or whatever, where somebody thinks they're like, oh no, I think she's cheating on me. And it takes the jurisdiction out. It takes this issue out of the husband's jurisdiction and puts it in God's hands. So that it would have to be a miracle, like God would have to do something miraculous, negatively miraculous, to the woman to demonstrate that she is guilty. So Ashley says this trial by ordeal prevents a jealous husband from punishing his wife on suspicion alone, and thereby protects her from what could be a death sentence at the hands of the community, because that would be the penalty for committing adultery is to be stoned to death. And so just on the husband's suspicion alone, she could be put to death. But this ordeal is a way of independently maintaining her innocence. Notice too that the woman, before she drinks the water, she's supposed to say, amen, so be it, which is a way of saying, no, really, I didn't do it.
Yeah.
I am innocent. So she would have an opportunity to confess before that if she had been guilty. This is a case where the husband is suspecting his wife. She's insisting that she's innocent. And this is a way of proving her innocence before God. So Ashley describes this as the solemn determination of the woman to declare her innocence before God. So it's in that context where he's suspicious. She insists that she hasn't been unfaithful, that we're taking it out of his hands and putting it in God's hands. So I do think if she was found innocent, that is, if she drank the water and nothing bad happened to her, I would think there would still be a pretty awkward season between her and her husband.
I imagine for
going
sure.
forward, right? Like it would take a while to rebuild trust again. As to your question about why there's not an equivalent test when a woman suspects her husband of being unfaithful, I don't know. I would really like this to go both ways.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't sit super well with me, but I don't get to decide what the Bible says. And I think what we're looking at is a cultural context where a woman's voice is not heard in the same ways, it doesn't hold the same weight in court. And so this one is more about restraining the voice of the man who could get her killed just based on suspicion. If the husband is unfaithful, presumably he's being unfaithful with someone else's wife, and then the whole scenario could happen on the other end.
The charges
right?
would come from a different direction.
The charges would come from a different direction. So if that other woman's husband suspects that something has happened and brings her to the priest, and she does miscarry, then it would have a ripple effect. Well, who's the responsible man? And it could come back to him. But
yeah.
We have no examples of this actually being put into practice.
Yeah.
There's no narratives that describe this as actually happening. This is a theoretical way of dealing with suspicion in marriage.
Yeah. All right. I got a few more. There's plenty to talk about here. Deuteronomy 22 says this: if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Now, this seems shocking to us because it feels like this is forcing a woman to marry a man who has raped her, which would be incredibly traumatic. What are we supposed to make of this?
Yeah, so I'm relying here on the work of Sandra Richter, she's published an article on this that I think is super helpful. And she backs up and looks at the structure of this whole section. So verses 13 through 29 are all talking about crimes against women or crimes involving women. And so they're dealing with sexual issues. Verses 13 to 22 are crimes involving a married woman. And then 23 to 29 are crimes involving an unmarried woman. And they're a chiasm, so they mirror each other. And what's happening in the larger context is quite remarkable because the woman is being treated as innocent until proven guilty. And that's quite clear from the context. So this is, it's worth reading her whole article. It's really great how she kind of lays things out. But this particular verse, these particular verses that you've just read for us, this is the final scenario, and it's a case of seduction requiring damages to be paid. So Sandy translates the word here as seduce rather than rape. And the reason for it is because it's not the normal word for grabbing. Hazak is normally the word for grabbing. And here it's tapas. And tapas is a parallel word to what happened in Exodus 22, verses 15 and 16 that we just looked at. So this is the parallel scenario where a man is persuading or coercing a young woman to lie with him, and then they're discovered. And she's not engaged, so it's not a matter of violating another man's marriage, but it is a violation of the father's responsibility to arrange a marriage for her. And so this is, again, a situation where the text is trying to prohibit a young man from just being casual about it. I'll quote from Sandy's article. She says, the girl in Deuteronomy 22:28 surely could have been manipulated or be under what we would consider a proper age, but not assaulted. Therefore, this law is designed not to punish the man for a violent capital crime, but to protect the young woman from the economic and legal insecurities that this irresponsible man has introduced. She becomes a wife in perpetuity, an apt consequence for our walkaway Joe. And so, because he's now responsible to pay the bride price as if she's still a virgin and like eligible for marriage. And after their encounter, she's not going to be as eligible. And so the bride price would likely go down because she's been with another man. And so her virginity hasn't been protected. And the reason why virginity matters so much in this context is because it's the woman's ability to bear children that kind of ensures that the property stays within the family. And so that comes into question as soon as she's been with another man. So according to Dr. Richter, this is a very similar case to Exodus 22. And reading the whole wider passage helps to illustrate, what specific case is this addressing?
So it's another unideal situation that
Right.
should not have happened, but
Right.
saying the damage being done to this young woman, especially in this cultural and economic context, there are ways to mitigate the negative effects. This would have harmed her beyond simply the trauma of the event, but would have had
Right.
economic ramifications that this man can not shirk off. He's got to actually take responsibility for the damage
Yes.
done, which is very
Yeah.
different for how we think about that. And I'm sure this certainly is not addressing the emotions and the wounds involved in
No.
this, but it is
No.
saying the material damage is being mitigated in some way.
Yeah. All of the case laws are like that. They're not trying to flesh out like what would it look like to emotionally care for or bring someone toward healing. They're looking at liability. Who is liable for the death or injury or violation in all these different cases?
Yeah. Just one comment. You referenced Sandy Richter. Just for those who are watching or listening, Dr. Richter's work on the Old Testament is some of my favorite. She's got a book called The Epic of Eden, which is just fantastic. So when someone's saying, how can I understand the Old Testament? I offer them two things. I offer them Carmen's books and I offer them Sandy's book. And those two things I think are really, really helpful for getting started. So she's worth checking out as well. All right. Another question. This comes more from kind of Leviticus territory, the next couple of questions.
Yeah.
When they're describing states that are clean or unclean in Leviticus, it includes menstruation. So why would that be considered unclean? Because that seems to put an extra barrier between women and God.
Yes. So the first thing to say is that it's important to distinguish between moral impurity and ritual impurity. So Leviticus has two separate sections that mirror each other, one about ritual impurity, one about moral impurity. Menstruation is not considered a moral problem. There's nothing sinful about having a period. And there's nothing sinful about any of the ritual impurity unless someone who's in a state of ritual impurity and tries to enter sacred space. That's what's dangerous and considered inappropriate. So I can see why it would feel like women are being singled out as having extra barriers. But there are also lots of things on the list that make a man ritually impure. So anytime he has an emission of semen, he's unclean, whether he was with his wife or whether it just happens while he was sleeping. If he has a discharge, a genital discharge that lasts a long time, that also makes him unclean. So women are not being singled out. Ritual impurity happens for both men and women for a variety of reasons. No one is entirely sure why things land on the list of stuff that causes ritual impurity. The list includes dead bodies, mold and mildew, skin diseases, and genital discharges. All of these things are causes of ritual impurity. The best sense that I've heard made of this list is that these are substances or states that have a connotation of life and death.
Yeah.
So snot isn't a problem. Like if you have a runny nose, it's no problem to come into sacred space. Or even if you're bleeding, like if you cut yourself, like you cut your arm and you're bleeding, blood doesn't make you ritually impure. It's menstrual blood that does, because menstrual blood is involved in bringing about life. Like it's associated with birth and pregnancy. So the logic that seems to make the most sense is that these substances are a matter of life and death, and that there's something particularly potent about them. And so to come into sacred space in that potent state is almost like you're competing. It's like a competing claim to the life giver that God is. And so a woman who, for example, has just given birth, she has a waiting period before she can enter sacred space again. This is not because she's done anything wrong, but it's sort of like putting like gasoline next to a match. Like you wouldn't want to do it. Like you shouldn't light a match at a gas station because that's dangerous. You also shouldn't come into sacred space if you're in a state of ritual impurity. It's not a system that makes natural sense to us because we're not thinking about sacred space in the same ways that ancient Israelites did. But it apparently made sense to them. I came across some Egyptian texts that require a priest who's reporting for temple duty. He has to tell his supervisor if he's been with a woman the night before. And if he doesn't, he could lose his job.
Yeah.
So this is not just an Israelite thing. It's something that's part of the logic of the ancient world at that time, that somehow sexual activity and the bringing about life is dangerous to come into contact with divine presence.
Yeah, there's a cultural barrier for sure for us. And
Yes.
maybe that applies to the next follow-up question. You talked about women being considered ritually unclean after childbirth, but when you look at it, it says, well, you're unclean for this amount of time if it's a boy, and a longer amount of time if the baby's a girl. Is there any? Can we make sense out of that at all?
Yeah, I mean, the text doesn't explain it, so all we can do is guess. But the best guess that I've heard is that because a baby girl will one day become a woman who has periods and can give birth, there's a sense that the situation is like doubly potent. So if it's dangerous to be ritually impure, it's like doubly impure because, and it's not like either of those things is a problem. It's more like it's a positive thing.
Yeah.
These women have the potency and the ability to bring life. And so they have to more carefully manage. It's almost like, oh man, there's all these superhero movies where superheroes are trying to keep their powers under wraps because like it's not appropriate to like let everyone know that you have this superpower. I don't know if this works, but I kind of feel like it's like, no, not here. Like you have is it in Matilda where Matilda's like trying not to
move
make
things with her
happen.
mind? Yeah.
Right. Or like in Wicked, like she's trying not to let people know that she has this ability to create havoc because it's like something inside of her. So I don't know if that's a good analogy.
I will have to think about that.
It's the one that makes sense.
But you're speaking my language when it comes to superheroes and that sort of thing. So I'll ponder that one. All
okay.
right. Another question, also kind of a Leviticus type question. It's about the priesthood. So all the priests are men. They're all particularly Aaron's sons. That means that there are no women who get to go into God's presence in the tabernacle the way the priests do. What do we think about that?
Yeah, so women are invited to come to the tabernacle to bring offerings. Presumably women could enter into the courtyard, but most men could also not enter the tent, the actual holy place. Only men from the tribe of Levi who are actually from the family of Aaron and who have been consecrated and who are wearing the right clothing and who are on duty and doing it according to God's design and instruction are allowed in. So it's not like all men get to have this access and all women don't. It's actually most Israelites don't get access. But you're right that there are no female priests. And the best explanation that works for me on this, there's two aspects, and this kind of relates to what we've just been talking about. Every woman is unclean 25% of the time when she's having her period, right? Depending on how long her cycle lasts. And so it would be logistically tricky to even do the scheduling of who's on duty today when women are on a regular cycle of being unclean. But in addition to that, the surrounding nations sometimes had sexual activity as part of the priestly duties or priestly prerogative. And the idea was they would go and worship Baal because they want Baal to bring fertility on the land. They want their crops to grow and they want to have babies. And so in order to inspire Baal to be to grant fertility, they would sometimes engage in sexual acts with priestesses in the temple. And God wants the Israelites to know from the very beginning, no, we are not doing that here. There's no sexual activity as part of the worship of Yahweh, because sexual activity is designed and restricted to a man and a woman who are married to one another. And so by only having male priests, that's one way that God ensures that they don't imitate Canaanite practices by having sex as part of it. And there's even a big deal made in Exodus that the priests have to wear underwear so that even when they're like walking up the ramp to the altar, they don't accidentally expose their nakedness.
Yeah.
Like the crowds who are gathered around to watch the sacrifice don't accidentally get flashed.
Yeah.
And so this is, I think, God going to great lengths to make sure that they understand he doesn't want them to imitate the nations around them.
Yeah. So it goes to great lengths to desexualize the religious cult. Okay. That's helpful.
Yep. So the overall worship of Yahweh is on the analogy of a marriage covenant.
Yes.
But he does not want that to include sexual practices in worship.
Yes, that's helpful. One other specific story here. It's in Numbers chapter 27. There's this kind of case that Moses has to adjudicate, and it's with a family where there were no sons to inherit. And so the daughters come and say, "What should we do here?" And they say this: "Our father had no sons to inherit his property, so we should get to inherit it when he dies, so it doesn't pass out of our family." And Moses says, "Yeah, that's the right thing," but it raises the question, why don't daughters get to share in the inheritance automatically?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great question. And it again exposes our cultural divide or cultural difference from ancient times. It's not that women have no value. This has to do with the way the inheritance system works. So God gave land to the 12 tribes of Israel, and there's strict laws about how that land gets passed down. And it needs all the land designated for a tribe has to stay in that tribe. Otherwise, you could end up with a really fruitful tribe kind of gobbling up the land of other tribes by intermarrying and sort of like trying to get their land as well. So if a daughter inherited land and then a man from another tribe married her, would he gobble up that land? And it would sort of become annexed to his tribal land. And so this is about maintaining parity between all the tribes so that they have the land God gave them and no one tribe comes to dominate everybody else. So that's why daughters don't normally get an inheritance. In this case, it's interesting because Zelophehad, the one who died, had no sons. And so that creates a new inheritance problem. Where's his land going to go if he doesn't have a son to give it to? Normally, daughters are free to marry anyone, any Israelite from any tribe, and they would just become part of that other family's household and tribal allotment. And she wouldn't maintain her tribal identity. She would become assimilated into the other tribe. So in this case, the decision is the daughters can inherit this property so that it maintains his family line, but they have to marry within the tribe that they come from so that the land doesn't end up getting annexed and added to another tribe. So it's trying to deal with two problems at once. And I think it's really cool that these women have the courage to speak up, to advocate for themselves. And Moses says, yes, there's no reason why a woman can't inherit property so long as the idea of keeping the land in each tribe is preserved. It would be okay.
Yeah. There's so much there that is so different from, like, there's a lot of kind of cultural things that are going on there. But that is really helpful because what it does is it actually reframes it in terms of making sure people are provided for well. In some ways, we look at it and say, well, what's being denied to these women? And instead it's saying, as a culture, as a society, are we making sure future generations and communities have what they need? And how does that actually work in terms of an economic system? It's cool. All right, let me back up and ask the kind of big picture question. We've been focusing on the really challenging, problematic passages. But if you were going to make a positive case that the Pentateuch gives dignity and value to women, what would you point to? What would you explain to somebody?
Mm-hmm. I absolutely think that the Bible is good for women. And we've been kind of coming at it the backdoor way, like thinking of all the possible challenges to that. But I think there are a lot of good examples of how women in that cultural context are being treated with dignity by God as conversation partners, as moral agents. The first the first person in the Bible to hear a word from the Lord, like an oracle, is Rebecca, and she's struggling when she's pregnant with the twins within her are fighting, and she seeks the Lord and receives a word from him. So we have women prophets, we have women who lead, we have women who see God meeting them in their time of need, like Hagar in the wilderness being provided for. So God is often working within these messy cultural and specific situations to address women and to kind of lift them out of that. A couple of examples come to mind. First of all, we already talked about Eve as a moral agent. I find it really heartwarming, maybe is the right word, that when God is cursing the serpent, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, which, as a side note, should have been there in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Because her role was to kibosh any intruders into the garden, and she hadn't done it. She hadn't had enough enmity. She had entertained a conversation with the serpent when she should have been casting him out of the garden. So I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. This suggests that Eve's story is not over yet, that she will bear children. And so God is not cutting her out of the story or writing her out of the story. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Even though Eve was responsible for disobeying God and cajoling her husband or enticing him to disobey as well, God isn't finished with her. And the story of redemption is going to play out with her offspring. So the fact that she owned what she did, she said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. So she confessed her sin. God is writing her back into the story, and she gets to be part of redemption. And if you go outside the Pentateuch, you can begin to see this happening. I mean, we would expect, if we're Eve, right away when she bears a son, this is going to be dealt with. And so we're watching her sons to see, will they crush the serpent? Will they crush his head? And instead, Cain crushes the head of his brother, which was not a good move, right?
Yeah.
So we have many generations where they pick the wrong enemy. But when we fast forward all the way to the book of Judges, and we have the story of Deborah and Barak, who go into battle on behalf of the Israelites against the Canaanites. And the Canaanite king Sisera is fleeing the battle, and he takes refuge in the tent of I think a Kenite woman. So she's not an Israelite. And she invites him into her tent. And you probably know the story. She kills him with a tent peg. She drives a tent peg through his skull while he's sleeping. She literally crushes his head. And her husband was an ally of King Sisera. So I think this is a really fun hyperlink between these two stories, where a Canaanite woman is switching allegiance from the enemies of God's people to the people of God, and she's participating by crushing the head of the one who is rising up against God's people. And she's the first of many. We have Rahab. We have actually Rahab is before that. We have Rahab before that, a Canaanite woman who declares allegiance to Yahweh. We have Ruth, the Moabite woman who declares allegiance to Yahweh and is incorporated into the people of God. So there are lots of women in the story who make the right choice and who work on behalf of God's people. And I think that's really fun to trace. And then in our last conversation, we talked about the women of Exodus.
Yeah.
I can't remember how much detail we got into, but we have the midwives, the daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter of Levi, all of these women who conspire together against Pharaoh. They defy Pharaoh and spare the life of Moses. And so not only are they positive examples in the story, but the narrator portrays them as doing the kinds of things that Yahweh does.
Yeah.
They're like a precursor of Yahweh's own saving action. So all these work together to tell me women have a role to play in the story that God is telling. And when we participate fully in the work he gave us to do as humans, made us his image, meant to be allies with the men in the story to accomplish God's purposes, that really excites me.
Yeah, that's really cool. As you were listing off those examples, I kept thinking, all of these are a little bit subversive, right? Like there's a way the world has become disordered that does put women below on the hierarchy. And these women who are faithful, doing these difficult things of choosing the side of the Lord, they in many ways they are cutting against the grain of the hand that's been dealt them, and yet they're coming out reflecting God in these actions. That's really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Imes, thank you so much for being with us again. This is always wonderful. Can you remind us where we can find you and your resources online?
Sure. So I have a YouTube channel. If you just look up Carmen Joy Imes, Imes, you can find it. It's called Torah Tuesday. I'm active on Facebook, on X, and on Blue Sky, and I have a blog. I write for Christianity Today. If you just Google my name, you'll find lots of stuff. But probably YouTube is the best place to go because I have playlists of lectures and sermons and other videos that I've done where people can find more information.
That's fantastic. Well, for all of you out there, I hope this has been helpful for you. It's been very helpful for me. As always, tune in each week as Pastor Courtney and Pastor David and I discuss passages from our Bible Savvy reading plan. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and our YouTube channel so that you don't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you on Monday.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us again next Monday for a new episode where we'll be looking at another passage from the Bible Savvy reading schedule. And in the meantime, if you're not following along with the reading plan, check out BibleSavvy.com. Also, you can subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Email us your questions or suggestions at podcast@BibleSavvy.com. Lastly, tell your friends, and we'll talk to you next week.